Without further ado, it's our pleasure to welcome Jane Cooper to speak to us this afternoon. Jane is an examination fellow at All Souls, and even more prestigiously, she's a regular attender of the Recollections lecture series here at Pusey House. So those really are the twin heights of intellectual life in Oxford University. So we're very glad to have her here today. Jane works in general on early modern poetry, mainly in the 17th century, but she's going to speak to us this afternoon on the title Piety versus Polemic, the Paradox of Elizabethan Satire. Jane, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. I know the title and indeed the content of this is a little bit obscure, even for my tastes, but the reason there are two reasons I've decided to talk about it. One is that this was actually the subject of my undergraduate dissertation, and it's not something I've really looked at in a while, so it was a pleasure to revisit it. And second, because I think there are a few things I discuss that are quite perennial about satire as a genre, you know, the hypocrisy that's difficult to avoid when writing it in particular. And there is something else that a broader audience might find interesting here, which is the theme of melancholy and its relationship to Renaissance letters and indeed to scholarship in general. So without further ado, and if you need any handouts, there are a couple here, I will begin. In the 1590s, satirical pamphlets trended in England, a vehicle for polemic which was often concerned with ecclesial matters and the integrity of the church. Satire was a hallmark of English culture, certainly by the end of the 16th century. Satirical pamphleteering was quite profitable for booksellers, but the authors themselves sometimes risked endangerment. As we shall see, the Marprelate controversy of the late 1580s culminated in a deadly witch hunt by Elizabeth's bishops of the troublesome Puritan or Puritans who authored pamphlets attacking the hierarchy of the Reformed Church. To establish a voice in these satirical pamphlets, which retained a kind of moral authority, whilst inheriting the style of Juvenal, was a difficult and, dare I say, even paradoxical task. Authors railed against contemporary vice and folly while exhibiting the same pride and lack of Christian charity which they attacked. As such, as my argument goes, satirists often adopted pseudonyms which were not merely identity veils, but personae, characters with lexicons of their own. I hope to illustrate how the distance between the author and his satirical persona really shaped Elizabethan print satires and satire on the Jacobean stage after it. So my talk will focus on the 1590s and the 1600s, a 20-year period or so which is conveniently split down the middle by the bishop's order, or the banning of print satire, which took place in 1599. It was a really remarkable event of state censorship. As Alvin Kernan argued in his brilliant 1959 book, The Cankered Muse, the bishop's order saw satire shift from pamphlets to the stage, giving rise to the stock character, which we may have heard of, called the malcontent, which featured heavily in a genre called the satirical comedy. And the satirical comedies were quite popular for a brief spell, written by the likes of Ben Jonson. As the name malcontent suggests, satirical personae in this period resembled the Renaissance trope of the depressive or melancholic man of letters. So I think it's worthwhile to add to Kernan's thesis by considering another paradox at the heart of satire. Literary men who adopted pseudonyms and satirical personae did so whilst emerging as public authors, exiting the cloisters of manuscript circulation, coterie readerships, and reliance on patronage. This was a really important time for the emergence of what we might now call a celebrity author. But it accompanied these pseudonymous characters, in the name of which many of these literary men wrote. Men who claimed in cynic fashion to loathe fame-driven aspiration and popular approval, whilst seeking to attain it, wrote a lot of the satires that I will discuss. And these men include Joseph Hall, who after his satirical career became Bishop of Exeter and then Norwich, the satirist and playwright John Marston, who also took holy orders after writing all kinds of really controversial satires, and Marston's more famous rival, Ben Jonson. These men had a precarious relationship with censorious government officials during a dynastic transitional period, and this only added to their notoriety. That many satirists were well known despite their use of pseudonyms, and that some didn't even use pseudonyms at all, tells us that this pseudonymous practice was not just it's not just done out of protection, like it was in the Marprelate controversy. Pseudonyms were a means of eschewing accountability for seemingly delighting in the moral ruination which they attacked. So to begin at the Marprelate controversy, I've included a rendering of the front text of the first Marprelate epistle, which was published in October 1588. Pseudonyms like Martin Marprelate, Thomas Telltruth, and Pasquill were widely recognised in 1590s London. They were, as I say, both protective veils of the identities of the satirists and familiar hallmarks of the viewpoints which were being promoted by the satires. So Martin Marprelate, as you might have guessed, was used by a Puritan or a group of Puritans who attacked the hierarchy of the Church of England in 7 pamphlets, Mar Prelate. And Pasquill, meanwhile, or the renowned Cavaliero, or Cavalier, was the pseudonym of an anti-Martinist pamphleteer or group of pamphleteers. And some have speculated that the likes of Robert Greene and John Lilly had been hired by the ecclesiastical authorities to turn their satirical wit against Marprelate, because Marprelate was brilliant and the bishops really needed the aid of funny men. Pasquill referred to Pasquin, the first talking statue of Rome, on whose base writers would pin anonymous satires and epigrams. In 1533, the English poet Thomas Eliot made the same connection with this name, and his titular character, Pasquill the Plain, was a plain-speaking humanist counsellor. So there was this virtue attributed to kind of what we might call today speaking truth to power in the form of epigrams and satires. After the Marprelate controversy ended with the hanging of John Penry, a Welsh Puritan who printed but probably didn't write the tracts, the English bishops were very wary of satire. So wary were they that on the 1st of June 1599, Richard Bancroft and John Whitgift, Bishop of London and Archbishop of Canterbury respectively, issued a sweeping order prohibiting the printing of all satires and epigrams, plus any dramatic works or histories which had not been approved by the Privy Council. They also named a few authors, so all the works of Joseph Hall, for instance, and Thomas Nash were to be destroyed and not printed thereafter, as well as specific titles like Thomas Middleton's Microcynicon, 6 snarling satires. And that really shows off the cynic dog language that characterised satire of the day. Diogenes, of course, was called the dog, since he claimed in his antisocial way that humans would do well to study dogs' behaviour. So in these satires, there's a lot of reference to biting and barking. The bishops included also some non-satirical publications on the list. They censored John Hayward's prose history, The Life and Reign of Henry IV, and specifically demanded that Hayward remove an epistle which hailed Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, as a great man, both in the present judgment and in the expectation of a future time. So that's not very surprising. Such a remarkable event shows how threatened Elizabeth's Privy Council were by satire's antisocial and anti-institutional leanings during a troublesome political time. So I want to go on to someone named John Marston, who I think is really at the centre of 1590s and 1600s satire. In Marston's satire, The Scourge of Villainy, he took on the pseudonym Kinsader, meaning one who castrates dogs, and he plays on Mar as well as in order to, I think, reference Marprelate, though he himself was not exactly puritanical. His whole point, though, was to establish a satirical persona which is kind of steeped in cynic anger. Kinsader sets himself up as a moral arbiter whose purpose is, I quote, to tear the veil from damned impiety. To the front of Satire 1, which particularly laments the discrepancy between appearances and the human inward disposition, Kinsader, or Marston, attached the Latin motto Fronti nulla fides, meaning no reliance can be placed upon appearances, taking directly from Juvenal's second satire. Kinsader then goes on to launch an attack against the superficiality of young men who, quote, hath stinking lungs, although a simpering grace, a muddy inside, though a sulphur'd face. Rather like Juvenal, one of his favourite things to attack was kind of effeteness in men. But Kinsader is also full of discrepancies. For instance, C.S. Lewis finds it embarrassing when Marston professes to be vicariously grieved, exclaiming, "Oh, split my heart, lest it do break with rage," since elsewhere Kinsader laughs at the folly and finds pleasure in it. "Oh, I am great with mirth, some midwifery, or I shall break my sides at vanity." He's saying, I need the help of a midwife. I mean, my sides are splitting. I'm laughing so much. And here's another piece of hypocrisy in the persona Kinsader. In the preface to Satire 1, to Detraction, Kinsader seems to reject, like the Cynics, the desire for fame and good opinion, which throughout the work stands in for the uninformed judgment of the multitude. Kinsader contends that, quote, true judgment slight regards opinion. My spirit is not huffed up with fat fume of slimy ale, nor Bacchus's heating grape. My mind disdains the dungy, muddy scum of abject thoughts and envy's raging hate. True judgment slight regards opinion, a sprightly wit disdains detraction. By preemptively railing against critics of his work, Kinsader is quite obviously guilty of that ultimate vice, which is pride. He declares all detraction to be simply envy's abhorred child, and claims that genius attendeth on and guides my powers intellectual. And then he addresses a preamble specifically to those that seem judicial perusers, courting their favourable opinion. That is, he intends to make a name for himself, whilst despising or claiming to despise the judgment of his readers. The hypocrisy is so funny, actually, that the satirical voice seems to function not just as the dispenser of the satire, but actually also as the object. Similarly, in Marston's licentious Ovidian narrative, The Metamorphosis of Pygmalion's Image, Marston pokes fun at his own speaker by making him a hypocrite, so this is a running theme. The poet first describes in detail Pygmalion's sculpture. Her breasts like polished ivory appear, whose modest mount do bless admiring eye, and makes him wish for such a pillow bare. Later the speaker quickly stumbles over himself to assure the reader that they will receive no explicit description of the lover's act. That would be licentious. He says, and now methinks some wanton itching ear with lustful thoughts lists to my muse, expecting for to hear the amorous description of that action. He immediately then proceeds to describe Pygmalion's desire for the sculpture's arms, eyes, hand, tongue, lips, and wanton thigh to be, quote, willing agents in love's luxury. But again, the poet draws back after indulging in this kind of blazon. Who knows not what ensues? Oh, pardon me, ye gaping ears that swallow up my lines, expect no more. Peace, idle poesy, be not obscene, though wanton in thy rhymes. So he kind of also blames the muse for whatever licentiousness has just been delivered, and then tells the reader, don't get excited. Satirists made fun of themselves as well as others. They also relished the opportunity to publicly battle one another, a practice which brought mutual benefit to authors who needed the publicity. One of Marston's public enemies, the aforementioned Joseph Hall, attacked him with an epigram which the author Virgidemiarum, that's the text that Hall was known for, caused to be pasted to the latter page of every Pygmalion that came to the stationers of Cambridge. So this is an epigram, this is a kind of short form little satire. In it, Hall attacks John Marston in the language, again, of cynic dogs. He calls him a mad dog or a mankind ass. He says, the dog was best cured by cutting and kinsing, the ass must be kindly whipped for wincing. So he's just sort of here, he's enshrining the kind of pithy and quite rude humour contained in epigrams, and how suitable these were for public rivalries between literary men, since they could just be appended at the end of one another's satires. Now, interestingly, Hall himself never adopted a pseudonym, but he did adopt a voice and, I think, two characters in his satire, the Virgidemiarum, or a bundle of scourges, a bundle of rods to scourge, that's what that means. In the satire, Hall takes on deadly sins, like envy, popery, and poetical bombast, calling out several clergymen, poets, and statesmen. The work is split in two, 3 and 3, reflecting the distinction that was drawn at the time between Juvenal and Horace. So Horace was understood to be a more reserved kind of satirist, to mock with wry amusement, whilst Juvenal was considered a much more personally involved, fiery, even tragic voice of rage and resentment. Whilst the first 3 of Hall's satires are called toothless satires, which identify problems poetical, academical, and moral, the 3 latter satires are called biting satires, and they attack individuals. So this is where the drama really kicks in. They crucially attack these individuals with pseudonyms. He couldn't have gotten away with it otherwise. And a lot of critical discussion today centres around the task of identifying the specific people that Hall attacks. Some people think that he attacks Edward de Vere, for instance, in his character Lolio. The incongruity between Hall's professed solemn mission to write, quote, plain uttering satires, and his indulging in the relish of attacking his personal enemies without naming them outright was quite characteristic of its time, and to us it seems completely hypocritical and outrageous, and it was deliberately so. Take also the delight that Hall takes when he describes the perceived horrors of Roman Catholicism. In Book 4, he depicts the Pope as an antichrist with a horned mitre and describes nuns being whipped into subservience. But that he most would gaze and wonder at is the horned mitre and the bloody hat, the crooked staff, their cowls' strange form and store, save that he saw the same in hell before, to see the broken nuns with new shorn heads in a blind cloister toss their idle beads. This resembles Juvenal's 10th satire, and indeed in that same satire, Juvenal actually he positions against one another the laughing philosopher Democritus and the weeping Heraclitus. Democritus in that satire rails against the ivory sceptre and the ostentatious crown worn by a magistrate. Hall evokes Democritus's laughter elsewhere, delighting in that which he is called to criticise. Here he says, and he sounds like Marston, "Now laugh I loud and break my spleen to see this pleasing pastime of my poesy, selling a laughter for a cold meal's meat." That both Hall and Marston took holy orders in around the same year, 1609, tells us about what authors of satire could disown and get away with, even in a time of censorship and danger. It also tells us that satirical voices were actually much closer to stage characters than we might think when we sit down to read a print satire, and that their authors, who set out to make a name for themselves, can be compared to actors who attain fame by portraying other people. The character of the satirist, while being perhaps nebulous before the time of the bishop's order, was really crystallized on the stage in the form of the malcontent. Now, malcontents were spiteful, envious, and melancholic, but they were also geniuses. And at times they laughed, just like Democritus, but mirthlessly and with a madness that was to be perhaps begrudgingly admired. The melancholic nature of the satirical persona is quite evident in Marston. In the proem to Book 1 of The Scourge of Villainy, Kinseder claims to suffer the great burden of duty in delivering just criticism. He describes himself as vexed, but then that he takes pleasure or relief in displeasing sharp control. "I bear the scourge of just Ramnusia, lashing the lewdness of Britannia. My vexed, thoughtful soul takes pleasure in displeasing sharp control." So Kinseder here outlines this kind of self-curative power of the satire. Not only does the satirist want to heal society of its ills by letting the humours and balancing them, but he also balances his own humours. Here, Marston resembles Joseph Hall, who laments that envy waits on my back, truth at my side. That is, the satirist has to bear the burden of being a fallen human, who is also vulnerable to things like envy, while painting human flaws in all their wicked reality. So herein lies a crucial aspect of Elizabethan and Jacobean satirical personae, that of their melancholic affliction, affecting both mind and body, which the satirist seeks to treat just as he would treat the moral malaise of his society. They always use humoral language. So Kinseder describes the satirist's purifying purpose in a wonderful couplet. I think I put it on the handout. Oh, what dry brain melts not sharp mustard rhyme to purge the snottery of our slimy time. That's great. So that sharp mustard rhyme is the rhyme of, it's the kind of, the purgative of his poetry that sort of draws out this snotty bile, perhaps, from the world around him. The dry brain also is being melted, which is to say its dry disposition associated with choler and melancholy is balanced. The wet humours, sanguine and phlegmatic, are introduced, and those humours associate respectively with social behaviour, prosocial behaviour, and reservedness as well. So this takes me on to more of a discussion of how the satirical condition was medicalised. Satirical personae were engaging in quite a popular practice when they claimed to suffer from a melancholic disposition. The satirist could eschew accountability for the more passionate aspects of his anger, and satire is then also doubly sort of justified because it is the method of letting a melancholic humour. Melancholy, importantly, was associated with scholarship. Some things never change. Elizabethan humoral theory entailed a mutually causal relationship between the physical and mental manifestations of melancholy. So mental exertion was said to draw heat and moisture from the brain, just as physical exertion draws heat and moisture from the blood, giving it a melancholic character. So hard work makes you melancholic. But as Lawrence Babb, who's a pioneer of humoral theory in this period, has said, so strong is the association between melancholy and learning that not only do the scholars tend to be melancholy, but melancholy persons tend to be scholarly. Aristotle associated melancholy with superior powers of intellect and creativity in the Problemata. Likewise, in the Nicomachean Ethics, which was one of the most widely disseminated classical treatises in this period, Aristotle gives righteous anger a special exemption from the passions. And that's definitely something that satirists or satirical personae take advantage of. So two variant Renaissance conceptions of melancholy existed in tandem. According to the Galenic tradition, melancholy is the most miserable condition of mind, and according to the Aristotelian, it is the most admirable, even enviable condition. Heeding the Aristotelian view of the melancholic man's interior excellence, various prominent Elizabethan men of letters caught the malady. The university wits, who were a group termed as such by George Saintsbury in 1887, were Oxford and Cambridge educated pamphleteers and playwrights spanning the 1590s and early 1600s. All of them wrote satires, and many wrote about their melancholy, giving it to themselves and to their own characters. These included Thomas Nash, Robert Greene, Thomas Lodge, George Peele, and Christopher Marlowe. Thomas Nash, his character Pierce in Pierce Penniless, declares he suffers a malcontent humour due to working hard in vain, for all my labours turned to loss, and resolves in verse to paint forth my passion. Similarly, in The Scourge of Villainy, Marston's Kinseder paints his satiric project as a medical one, professing to let sinners of their infectious blood in Satire 5. Infectious blood, ye gouty humours quake, whilst my sharp razor doth incision make. So satire is a means, as I say, of restoring society's health. To assist in this medical project, Kinseder invokes melancholy as his muse, so that's really quite bold. He says in the proem to Book 1, "Thou nursing mother of fair wisdom's lore, ingenious melancholy, I implore thy grave assistance. Take thy gloomy seat, enthrone thee in my blood. Let me entreat, stay his quick icon skips and force him run a sad-paced course until my whips be done." So by inviting this kind of despondence, rather than merely suffering a precursory affliction, Marston performs this sort of self-sacrifice on the altar of satire. And if the invective of his satires were a product of melancholy, then his endeavour can be seen as a noble project, whose main objective isn't to take down opponents for the sheer hateful fun of it, but to gravely attempt to correct society's vices from a loftier standpoint. And this, as I say, I think answers the paradoxical nature of satirical invective with a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card. It's notable that Marston dedicated the scourge to, quote, his most esteemed and best beloved self. Here he forgoes the conventional mode of dedication to an aristocratic patron, which could, in times of need, actually serve as protection from a governmental witch hunt. By cultivating a melancholic persona as a shield, he defiantly replaces the usual method of safeguarding. I speak about how the melancholic satirist can become the object of satire as well as the dispenser, and that really takes off on the Jacobean stage after 1599. The hypocritical malcontent, who did serve as a satirist, but often invited laughter for being overblown and ridiculous, became quite quickly a stock character. Prominent Jacobean malcontents include recognisable figures, Shakespeare's Jacques, Timon and Hamlet, Webster's Bosola, and Middleton's Vindice. Marston was the instrumental writer of the stage malcontent as well. As the title suggests, his stage satire, The Malcontent, 1603, stars this dramatic type. The deposed Duke Altafronto of Genoa puts on a professional garb of cynicism and melancholy and becomes Malevolent, who rails against the follies and abuses of society. And note the Italian setting, because that's important. It goes back to the kind of ineluctably Roman roots of the satires and of the Pasquin statue. The literal disguise of the malcontent here recalls the more nebulous narrative mask of the satirists that you get in print. Malcontents also featured heavily in something called the War of the Theatres, or the Poetomachia, as termed by Thomas Dekker. This war was a series of back and forths between Ben Jonson and his playwright rivals, including Marston and Dekker. Shakespeare also, he's sort of involved at the fringes of the Poetomachia. The Poetomachia, the War of the Theatres, begins with Marston depicting Ben Jonson in his play Histriomastix, or The Player Whipped. Marston appears as someone called Chrysogonus, the Golden-born, and he's mocked for his obsession with patronage and his obsession with being the popular boy. This is a sort of strange little allegory play that was probably performed by non-professional players, given that most of it is actually mocking the players themselves. Ben Jonson then replied and attacked Marston in the form of the masked malcontent Masilente in Every Man Out of His Humour, 1599. The malcontent in this case is actually someone named Asper, who puts on this mask to expose all of the other characters' vices, which each pertain to their humoral imbalances, and then enacts a kind of bloodletting via public humiliation. So Masilente is driven by envy, and though he is basically in the right, he's a really quite despicable and unlikable character. Nevertheless, at the end, he is himself cured of his melancholic humour when confronted with the vision of Queen Elizabeth on stage. Who else? Just a single vision of the Queen imparts this reforming power, lets his blood of the melancholy, and balances the humours, and the play comes to an end. So Marston and Jonson, despite this public back and forth, went on to collaborate, actually, writing a play called Eastward Ho together in 1605. This satire attacked Scotland, among other things, and so was not exactly pleasing to the new King James, who had them both imprisoned. It seems that their public rivalry was actually just a competitive performance, after all. Since I've discussed the rise of this melancholic celebrity author figure, which accompanied and perhaps provided a substratum for that of the melancholic satirical persona, I think I should mention John Donne. Donne's satires in the early 1590s never reached print, but they were so widely circulated in their manuscript form that they reached a sort of level of transmission that might be considered publication. Notoriously afflicted with ill health and a depressive state, Donne's prose and poetry throughout his life, including the 5 satires, referred to his self-understanding as a melancholic character. His conception of melancholy was quite inextricable with his religious experience, which he translated into his prolific literary depictions of spirituality. He described his verse as a direct product of his, quote, low devout melancholy. And in a verse epistle, this is to someone whose identity I haven't figured out, Mr. T.W., Donne declares, I languish, pressed with melancholy, and describes his verse as, quote, the strict map of my misery. As a pioneering author of verse satire, in which he presents his young persona, attempting to find himself really in a corrupt world, Donne encapsulates this confluence of the Elizabethan satirist and the author who is painted as a melancholic man, a nobleman in some intellectual sense. Donne's authorial self-portraiture was, of course, not restricted to literature. He famously commissioned the New Battle panel portrait of himself, which I've printed in black and white. And as I said at the beginning, that it was meant to be printed in colour, but he looks even shadowier and like more dramatically melancholy this way. He called it that picture of mine which is taken in shadows, which served as less as a depiction of personal likeness than a testimony of rank and power, in the words of Germaine Greer. Donne here is sicklier with a pale cast of thought, gazing past the spectator, his expression difficult to ascertain. Germaine Greer's article examines quite well, I think, its historical elusiveness and magnetism, its reception through the centuries. It has a contrived air of brooding darkness, which I think welcomes her interpretation of the portrait as a Juvenalian persona. Juvenal, of course, writhes and spits in his black bile, and so does Donne. His third satire begins, kind pity chokes my spleen. The spleen was thought to be the source of black bile. Elected as Master of Revels in 1593, Donne can be viewed as an early configuration of the celebrity author with melancholy. And I think that portrait is the best evidence for Lawrence Babb's thesis that young men of letters who travelled to Italy were the, quote, principal immediate cause of the melancholia in English life and literature. I do think his claim to suffer from melancholy was sincere. It's a consistent theme in his private and personal writing. But I also think that other poets at the time, especially those who would have read this incredibly kind of widely circulated manuscript series of Donne's, noticed that melancholy lent him something and thought that they too should map their misery and let their humours in verse. So to conclude, I think I have to touch on Robert Burton. The melancholic persona, which is at once distinct from the author and sort of wedded to him, which both dispenses satire and I think suffers at the hands of it, finds its extreme in Robert Burton's persona, Democritus Jr., who again refers back to the laughing philosopher, the mirthless laughter. Robert Burton remarkably had his memorial bust, which is still visible today in Christchurch Cathedral, emblazoned not with his own name, but with that of his pseudonym, Democritus Jr. So he literally set in stone the status of his fictive persona as inextricable from himself in death as well as in life, an act which transgressed, I think, the decorum of burial in a Christian place of worship, but John will know that better than I do. His relationship to his own melancholic persona echoes what we see in its genesis in the 1590s, in the print satires of people like Marston and the university wits. Burton also, like Marston, framed his writing as a cure, saying his purpose was to ease my mind by writing, for I had a kind of imposthume in my head, which I was very desirous to be unladen of, and could imagine no fitter evacuation than this. So I think this explanation of writing as a means of evacuating troubled thoughts, rather like the letting of a humour that is preponderant, recalls a very Elizabethan moment in which melancholy was a vehicle for medicalising the condition of both Elizabethan society and the person tasked with that grave burden of being the satirist. In the context of satire's censorship, in the gloaming of Elizabeth's reign, this framing, this medical framing, responded also to concerns about accountability, concerns held by writers of an historically anonymous and pseudonymous genre. Marston and Johnson's brushes with the law, both via the bishop's order and as playwrights, testify to the real threat that still existed. And their Christian messages, remember, a lot of this vitriol is directed specifically to the deadly sins and to that eighth deadly sin, popery, so often clashed with the nature of its delivery. It's no surprise then that the genre of satire was so replete with masks. And that's all.
Thank you, Jane, for a fascinating talk. We've got loads of time for questions, and so perhaps I'll let you pick whoever sticks their hand up. And I might kick us off with a quick one, if that's all right, which is you've stressed that the main models for satire for these authors at the turn of the century are Roman, and that they're participating in this very sort of thick classical tradition. Just out of curiosity, is there much sign that they're reading satirical works of previous Christian generations? The reason, the person that I'm thinking of in particular is obviously Erasmus,
Yeah.
whose Iulius Exclusus and the Praise of Folly were, crazy bestsellers in the middle of the 16th century. Were people still reading them at the turn of the century?
Yes.
Have they all had a diet of Erasmus?
Yeah, no, very much so. Humanism in general is completely bound up with late 16th century, early 17th century satire. Via Erasmus, via Thomas More, and they do refer back to folly quite often, Erasmus's folly, so it's a stock, folly is a stock character as well, actually. They also draw on an older English tradition. Now, it's funny, Joseph Hall declares in the preface to his Virgidemiarum that whoever follows him will be the second English satirist. So I am the first, he says. And this actually popularizes that satire because, of course, it's not true. One of the biggest satirical names was Chaucer, and Piers the Plowman was considered one of these plain-speaking satirical figures that you might name yourself after if you're trying to speak truth to power, as it were, especially in the ecclesial context. So there's an English tradition via Chaucer, and there is of course that Erasmian humanistic tradition as well. Yeah. Paul?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jane. Really interesting. I just want to pick up the last thing you said about Burton writing to cure himself. I think there's also a sense in anatomy that writing is actually his disease and that it's making it worse. I just wonder if you talked a bit about how satirists in this time write to get themselves out of melancholy. Do you think they're also writing themselves into melancholy?
I think that there's no way they weren't writing themselves into it. Precisely because, anyone who's written knows this. It's sort of not a very pleasant experience. But they were self-consciously owning melancholy as their own because they were authors. So everyone knew if you're a man of letters, then you are disposed to melancholy, precisely because, the hard work on the brain is drawing out the kind of humours from the blood, but also, as Aristotle says, that, the really creative geniuses are also the most melancholic. So there's a sort of another little tension or paradox here, which is the authors kind of luxuriating in their authorly misery by writing so much and by taking on this quite difficult task of the satirist, but also saying, look, satire has a curative function. It cures me of my melancholy. It will cure society of its humoral imbalances too. It's quite unconvincing, but at the same time, when you read Burton, I think it's sincere. I think he probably did have a very mixed emotional experience when writing his anatomy. Yeah. Oh, Ty.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jane. I'm interested in maybe the mix or the transition. You described a little bit about how kind of catching this genre was and how associated it became with the scholarly life. But these celebrity satirists, maybe especially the playwrights, are they also balancing their other work in other genres? Are they giving that up so much? And maybe what's the interaction between? Are they kind of streets of satire in the stall in the market, but that's getting people in the seats in the playhouse next decade? I don't know.
That's a really good question. I think the inherently quite fighty and controversial nature of satirical pamphlet wars was, that was a publicity tactic in large part, and that gets back to the fact that clearly Marston and Johnson were actually sort of frenemies, because in attacking one another in satirical form in their plays, they got more bums on seats. Like, oh wait, he's pretending, that's Marston dressed up as, or this is a parody of Johnson. So that kind of thing it attracts crowds, and it did accompany, as I say, the sort of the emergence of these men as well-known celebrities whose personal lives were slightly plastered in the public forum in the form of granted quite kind of veiled satirical reference. So yeah, I think whether authors prioritize satire is not clear. Some did and some didn't. Marston certainly prioritized satire. I mean, the major contributions are satirical comedies, the plays, The Malcontent being one. Whereas Ben Jonson was just so prolific that I wouldn't say satire took centre stage for him. And he was always writing elegies for the various patrons and things like that as well, and writing masques. So it depends really on who we're talking about.
I didn't quite catch what the reason behind the 1599 ban on satire was, but I'm sort of more wondering what was the public reaction to that, or the reaction of the authors themselves? Did they sort of think this is outrageous, or did they think perhaps, okay, maybe we did go a bit far?
Well, the reaction was interesting because I think the bishops quickly realised this wouldn't work in practice, so they actually retracted several of the titles on the list and said, okay, well, we'll grant a reprieve for this title and this title and this title. And indeed, printers didn't stop printing satire, but they were for a few years, certainly before Elizabeth died, there was a downturn because they just didn't want the government on their backs. I think one of the reasons, so there's a lot of speculation as to why then, why exactly then, and why did they ban all satire? I actually think it was probably a guise. I think they probably cared a bit less about satire than they did about sedition, in particular in prose histories, which depicted kind of anyone like the Earl of Essex, say, who was a threat in terms of the succession, depicted them in historical people. That was happening quite a lot in the realm of verse history and prose history. So they wanted a reason to to censor that stuff, but it had to look principled. So they said, we're clamping down on licentiousness. Satire is full of dirty jokes, and this is unchristian, so we'll get rid of all satire. Most satire wasn't really licentious before it was, for instance, personally rude. Lots of bishops also had been mocked in the satires, and that was annoying for the Privy Council. But I actually think that they were using satire in the bishop's order almost as a kind of justification for their censorship of more politically troublesome texts, like the history of the life of Henry IV, which I mentioned, that sort of put in a good word for the Earl of Essex. So that's my take. There's a lot of sort of discussion. It hasn't quite been figured out, but yeah. George?
On that sort of similar theme, and obviously if you're a government, there are two reactions. There's to people writing sort of satirical verses and so on, often attacking you. Is you can either bring in censorship, or you can patronise your own satirists to sort of hit back, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, did they? And there's a sort of if you go back later into the 17th and early 18th century, governments sort of shift more towards deciding to get the best journalists on their side rather than, and they sort of move away from outright censorship.
Yeah.
But is this a sort of ambivalence that they had at the time? Because presumably people who were satirising the Puritans are probably, I would have thought, more, the bishops probably were more happy. Did they consider like encouraging their own satirists, or did they start to see the discourse and start to see the limitations of outright censorship? Or
I think firstly it showed them that such a sweeping sort of act of censorship wouldn't really work. It's curious because Thomas Nash was listed on the bishop's order, despite very plausibly having been enlisted a decade before by the bishops to answer Martin Marprelate, along with people like John Lilly, as I mentioned. So it looks like the same, the same author who was fairly religiously middle way, was being punished by the bishop's order, who had actually been useful in the midst of the Puritan pamphlet war era of the late 1580s. That's something I can't quite wrap my head around. Basically, a lot of historians think that this bishop's order was just sort of, it was performative on the question of satire, much less on the question of being able to read dramatic works and histories before they went to print. That was a big part. That was a big reason. They were like, nothing that the Privy Council hasn't read in advance should be printed. And oh, by the way, satire needs to go because it's immoral. But you're certainly right. After that point, when it becomes clear satire will still flourish, English censorship it really kind of dies out actually. At the end of over the next 200 years. I mean, it ebbs and flows, but it was a quite important moment, I think, in the history of censorship, a moment that showed it didn't really work.
Did any of the authors of the time reflect theologically on the significance of their work, in the sense of why satire was an appropriate vehicle for a Christian society or a Christian writer? And if they did, was it ever connected to any of the paradoxes of Christian doctrine, Almighty God who takes on a form of weakness, or the difference between the way in which Christ is seen and what we know about him? Were there any theological reflections of that sort?
That's a very good question. I want to say that these kinds of satires were overwhelmingly classical. All of the pseudonyms they certainly didn't use biblical names as pseudonyms and things like this. The references are all going back to not just Horace and Juvenal, but in general to kind of classical texts, Ovid, and they avoided blending this genre with too much actual theology and indeed too much scriptural recourse. I can't give you an example of where maybe there is a theological reflection. So the theology goes so far as to say, well, Roman Catholicism is evil. Maybe the hierarchy of bishops in this country are failing because they're power hungry rather than motivated by, the virtues or charity. But so to that degree, it's a blend of Christian moralizing and kind of classical reference. But yeah, I can't think of any reference to Christ himself, but I mean, I would have to, there are so many of these things, I'm sure that it exists.
Hi, was there any connection to the cosmology of the time, like planetary influences? Are they associated with any satire?
I don't know. I have to say, I should know, but in my defence, I haven't really looked at this period for several years, and I'm just returning to it. I mean, in Burton, there's that, very natural philosophical interest and a huge range of kind of scholarly and hermetic things.
Yeah.
But I don't know about the 1590s. I mean, there's a correction. The planetary spheres, the cosmos, these are referred to quite often in the literature, whether it's a play or, but I don't know about how it would interact in a very interesting way with satire as a distinct genre.
I was wondering if you could say more about, you mentioned the connection between melancholy and kind of righteous anger as it appears in ethics. And in particular, the righteous anger, of course, has kind of an important role to play in pushing to action, sort of the rational mind's impetus to action. Whereas, today I would read melancholy as having a connotation of resignation or, well, there's nothing I can do about it. Was that kind of impetus to action more a connotation of melancholy in Elizabethan era? And do you think the satirists would have read it that way?
Yes, so I think we understand melancholy now really as depression, which might suggest apathy, inaction, complete listlessness. This wasn't quite true of the Elizabethan understanding of melancholy. Melancholy was much more associated with anger, and anger with action, whether that action was, just verbal or not, but mostly that action was limited, in fact, to speech, rather than to going and changing the world. So Hamlet is a good example of this, right? The half malcontent. Hamlet is active in his words and thoughts. He's deliberately positioned as this incredibly crafty speaker, but he can't really bring himself to act in important moments in the ways that he wants to. So I suppose inaction is emerging as part of melancholy, but the action of the satirist doing satire, that leads directly from the sense of righteous anger that the satirist has, and indeed unrighteous anger.
I was intrigued by what you said about pseudonyms being widely known, because that would seem to sort of obviate the point of pseudonyms. Is there a sense in which all of this is tacitly accepted, but people can't be seen to explicitly go along with it?
Well, so for instance, lots of people, everyone who read Kinsader knew that it was Marston. When I said that pseudonyms were widely known, I mean names like Martin Marprelate, where Marprelate just became a word to mean, Puritan who attacks the hierarchy, and indeed Pasquil that's known as the kind of answer of the church to the anti-Puritan. So it's true, yeah. Pseudonyms were basically by the turn of the century much less about hiding an identity and more about, as I say, representing a character who takes the impulses of the author to an extreme, and so who in that way can be distanced from the author himself, and so the satire can then be delivered, because it's you can't take seriously or you cannot take at face value quite a lot of what is in the satires, because it's so extreme, and it's not something that a man would say to another man standing in front of him in a room. It's the words of a character. Yeah.
Following up on the idea of personas, and you mentioned the Boston Christchurch with the personae, was there ever a case when satirists started writing in his private letters versus his satire, very clear distinction, but as he wrote more satire, you could kind of see that leaking into his private letters, so he becomes this character that he's trying to emulate.
Yeah. It's funny, I talked a lot about the distance between authors and their personae, but there's not that much distance. It's still, the author is still responsible for all of these words, and the kinds of sentiments expressed come from personal place, I think, in the case of all of these men. It's just that the mode of expression, the register, some of the literary markers, they belong to a character, but this is still, you know, they are still inextricable, author and persona. So I certainly, agree with your point, and Burton is a good example of that. And indeed, it's amazing that in death, you know, he's called Democritus Junior. That's quite a personal display of allegiance with Democritus Junior. Yeah.
Can you tell us anything about this epigram that was caused to be pasted to the last page of all the Pygmalion democratization?
Yeah. So it's, I've got it. Did I put it on the handout? I think so. Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a funny one. I mean, where is it? Oh yeah, the little quatrain below is not in the epigram. That's not clear.
Okay.
But so it's just the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's the 8 lines. Yeah, I mean it's I little pass whether thou be a mad dog or a mankind arse. It's just a sort of slightly intricate conceit saying that a dog is as good as an arse and that it should be whipped, and that, you know, it is indeed Marston, this Diogenes figure with this kind of noble cynic attitude, or is he a laughingstock? Yeah.
Have you seen copies that have of Pygmalion that have this lip on them?
Yeah, a while ago, this was when I was writing this for the first time. There is still there's a digitized picture somewhere, I think, on Solo, where you can see this pasted to a copy of Pygmalion. They weren't pasted, of course, to every copy. So this was the performative hope of Hall, that this would be posted to every single copy. But, of course, it wasn't.
Okay.
But yeah.
All right, well, I think we'll show our appreciation to our speaker for a fantastic lecture and for answering all of those questions. Jane, thank you.